Tonight, we're pleased to welcome David Alff, author of the new book, The Northeast Corridor, to Mass Bay RE this evening with a program based on the book that we're calling The Northeast Corridor in the Bay State. David teaches in the English department at SUNY-Buffalo, where he specializes in the literature of 18th century Britain. He also writes about infrastructure for academic and general audiences. His essays have appeared in the Washington Post, Time Magazine, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the Boston Review. Tonight, David will be talking about his book, The Northeast Corridor, the trains, the people, the history, and the region, which came out from University of Chicago Press in April. The Wall Street Journal called Corridor a chronicle filled with reliably fascinating facts, and Bloomberg Media referred to it as an ode to the line that explains how trains became essential, if frustrating, fixtures of bustling metropolises from the mid-Atlantic to New England. So, David, congratulations on the book and welcome to Mass Bay RRE.
Thank you, David, for the opportunity to join you tonight. And thanks everyone in the group for logging on. As a non-New Englander, I especially appreciate this opportunity to share my work and to learn from you all. I'm going to talk for about 50 minutes with slides and then open things up to question, answer, and discussion. I live in New York, not New York City, but New York State, at the far end of the Thruway, at the last lock of the Erie Canal, at the second to last stop on Amtrak's Empire service, in the Rust Belt border town of Buffalo. I live in Buffalo, but come from the Eastern Seaboard, specifically the suburbs outside Philadelphia. Growing up in Bucks County, we used to watch trains rush through Croydon, Pennsylvania. It was the 80s. I remember SEPTA Silverliners pulsing by, some bearing the faded logo of their former operator, the Penn Central. I remember Amtrak AEM 7s, so boxy and Swedish, towing their columns of Amfleet coaches. I learned about these trains and others from my late grandfather, Richard Delaney of Spuyten Duyvil in the Bronx. Richard was a prolific rail fan and son-in-law of a Long Island Railroad engineer, my great-grandfather. My 9-year-old daughter, Mira, has inherited the family's fascination with trains. It's in her blood. Mira knows which whistles go with freight, which belong to Amtrak. She knows that the arrival of the Toronto-bound Maple Leaf at Exchange Street signals the end of her school day. Like me, Mira's happy to pack a lunch and hit the platforms at Depew with a sketch pad or notebook. Unlike me, she has a perfect knack for color coordination. When I moved from Philadelphia to Buffalo in 2012, I became starkly aware of being from the Northeast. I felt it in my patterns of speech, my pace walking sidewalks, my allergy to driving. And I realized that a big part of what I missed about home were its trains. There were so many of them that I rode, and even more that I saw at Croydon and later heard from my apartment in downtown Philly. I missed the sizzle of catenary, the pungency of creosote, the cherry almond scent of Amtrak soap, the fake oak interiors of New Jersey Transit's Arrow MU coaches. I missed the coming and the going and the feeling of being looped into something beyond my home. I missed the look of 30th Street Station in winter sunlight and the smell of Trenton's track bed after spring rain. And so, in Buffalo, in the lonely depths of the pandemic, a time when few of us were going anywhere, I wrote a book about the railroad and the places it connects, including the place that I'm from. I wrote specifically about the tracks that solder Boston to Providence, New Haven, New York, Trenton, Philadelphia, Wilmington, Baltimore, Washington, and points between, and how those tracks became what we now call the Northeast Corridor. The Northeast Corridor, as I'm sure all members of this group would know, is the busiest and fastest intercity passenger rail line in North America. Corridor trains carry some 800,000 riders each day, a head count greater than the populations of Seattle, Denver, and San Francisco. Trains deliver those people to hundreds of thousands of jobs, including 1/3 of Fortune 100 firms, 263 colleges within 5 miles of a station, and over 30% of civilization's most visited museums. The line links one of the world's most powerful financial centers to its most consequential political capital. Economists estimate that closing the corridor for a single day would sacrifice $100 million worth of labor to gridlock. The line enables 17% of the country's population to live on less than 2% of its land. So the corridor is a gift from history and a tool for survival. While testifying before Congress, Temple University President John Fry called it America's greatest transportation asset. So great is this asset that the word corridor has grown synonymous with its region. People do not simply ride the corridor, but live there too. Once home to tens of thousands of Algonquins, this coastal band between the District of Columbia and Massachusetts became a beachfront for colonial conquest, a testbed of the Industrial Revolution, a fiscal laboratory, source of global policy, and a constellation of cities that the geographer Gene Gottman called megalopolis. Like Rust Belt, Deep South, Silicon Valley, and Appalachia, corridor has become shorthand for what many think of as the region's defining features: its brisk pace of life, diversity, and comparative affluence. But as I show in my book, that's barely half the story. As any passenger can tell you, the corridor races through forests and along shorelines, past weedy lots and chemical plants, through villages and cities and marsh. Yes, Manhattan, but also Saybrook, Washington Shore, but don't forget Cornwall Heights, Bridgeport, Mystic, and the rest. You can learn a lot about the Northeast from gazing out a coach window. But there's a lot that you can't know from simply riding a train. There's so much that I did not know or did not fully appreciate until I undertook the years of research to write this book. While today's corridor may feel like a single seamless piece of infrastructure to most riders, it's really a patchwork of many railroads whose names live on in archives. I would bet that fairly few 21st century passengers have heard of the Boston and Providence, the Harlem River and Port Chester, the Camden and Amboy, the Philadelphia and Trenton, the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore, and the Baltimore and Potomac, even as they coast over their former rights of way. And many of these ways are older than the railroads they host. Some pieces of the corridor's original route originated as colonial post roads that had previously been Pequot, Mohegan, and Lenape traces. Today's trains follow a lot of footsteps along some deeply rutted ways. Now, I think, is a good time to get to know what we have inherited. The Northeast Corridor is a vital, sometimes vexing public work in the public eye at a moment when many of us wonder whether the country's fraying quilt of roads, bridges, railroads, sewers, dams, and pipelines will hold together or collapse. A time when regional identity holds enormous electoral weight. We should learn more about the corridor's past to understand where the line will lead us next. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the northern and easternmost 38 miles of the line, which run through the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. These miles pack in some of the corridor's most interesting features, including one of its oldest rights of way, one of its most imposing architectures, the Canton Viaduct, and of course, one of its great terminals, South Station, once the busiest train hub in the world. In preparing this presentation, I realized that Massachusetts offers chronological bookends to my story. One could argue that the corridor began in Massachusetts when the Boston and Providence first laid rails in the 1830s. One might similarly venture to say that the line was only completed in the late 90s when Amtrak strung catenary from New Haven into Boston. I'm going to talk mostly about these bookends with a brief tour of notable events in between. Part 1, Canton. Railroaders rarely sign their creations. The tracks they lay and the paths they embank remain anonymous. A railroad is not a novel or a fresco, but an artifact of many hands lost to time. Canton, Massachusetts might be the exception. Here, an arcade wall carries corridor trains over the Neponset River. If you park by the Honeydew Donuts and walk down Neponset Street, as I did 2 autumns ago, you'll come face to face with a stone wall full of strange graffiti. diamonds, triangles, pluses, hourglasses. Each mark belongs to an ancient Masonic alphabet. Each scratch identifies, credits, and holds culpable whoever cut the stone. Each autograph signifies someone who helped build the corridor. Many masons were carving granite in Canton in 1834. Over hilltops and cedar bogs carried the ring of bladed hammer on rock, the bray of horses, and the brogue of ballast crews. By day, Canton Ravine echoed with the toil of Scotch and Irish immigrants. At dusk, the workers retired to camps where they drank so much beer and brawled so fiercely that the Commonwealth militia deployed twice to quell riots. This rowdy crew came to Canton to raise a stone curtain, a solid-seeming but actually hollow wall that cast its shade over the river, over the meadow where cows browsed, and the foundry where Paul Revere's son, Joseph Warren, melted copper into ore that wrapped naval hulls and the State House dome. The wall would fuse two track segments, one track from the India Point docks in Providence and the other from Park Square, Boston. Canton Viaduct sprang from the minds of three West Point graduates. The North Carolina brevet major William Gibbs McNeill oversaw the project. His classmate and brother-in-law, George Washington Whistler, assisted. Whistler had just fathered an infant named James, who would grow up moody, get drummed out of West Point by Academy Superintendent Robert E. Lee, before blossoming into one of the era's most exquisite painters. This is Whistler's 1871 portrait of the artist's mother. McNeill and Whistler were joined by an artillery engineer from Virginia named Isaac Ridgway Trimble. Trimble appears several times in my book. Years after working on the Canton Viaduct, he served as chief engineer and superintendent for the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad, and later became a major general in the Confederate Army. In 1861, Trimble famously led a posse that hijacked a train in Baltimore and drove north through Maryland along the corridor's present route, setting fire to bridges to sever Union communications between Philadelphia and Washington. So back in 1834, McNeill, Whistler, and Trimble teamed up to design and build the Canton Viaduct. Each of the men learned their trade in the laboratory of American traincraft, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. From its ceremonial groundbreaking at Gwynns Falls in 1828, America's first common carrier embarked on a sometimes heedless adventure in their attempt to lay rails west to the Ohio Valley and potentially on to the Pacific coast, as some of its original investors hoped. The B&O's experiments included laying rails atop granite stringers rather than wooden cross ties. They included a sail car that purportedly notched 20 miles an hour when the wind blew the right way, and later the introduction of the Tom Thumb locomotive. From Maryland, McNeill and Whistler traveled to Britain, where they met the father of railways, George Stephenson. The Americans would return the favor in Canton by hosting two Russian engineers, Pavel Petrovich Melnikov and Nicholas Ossipovich Kraft. Kraft and Melnikov were sent to Canton by Tsar Nicholas I to study American construction techniques. Therefore, the Massachusetts foothills became a global technology expo. The connection could not come soon enough for Boston. As the 1800s dragged on, the city's location became a liability. Boston had, for over a century, commanded the North Atlantic coast, though it lacked something that was now equally important: a cheap, fast, all-weather connection to the continental interior. Boston was too east for its own good, in the throes of Erie fever, when New York's cross-state canal made Manhattan merchants into America's first transshipment kings. How, wondered one Massachusetts legislator, could the Commonwealth, quote, keep pace with our sister states? Boston journalist Nathan Hale had the answer, or at least he thought he had the answer. He proposed to lay rails to Albany and to Providence. Hale's plan endures in the smudgy print and water-stained pages of an old pamphlet, remarks on the practicability and expediency of establishing a railroad on one or more routes from Boston to the Connecticut River. The pamphlet describes horses towing carriages between Boston Common and Narragansett Bay at speeds up to 3 miles an hour. Hale proposed cutting the rails not from wood, but from Massachusetts granite, and then packing the gaps between ties with earth and gravel to form a path for the horses. Each train, in Hale's plan, would include a platform car, quote, on which the horse himself may ride on downhill sections. The road would pay for itself by levying 50-cent tolls on passengers. By the time state legislators granted their charter, steam locomotives had replaced horses and wooden ties succeeded granite stringers. In 1828, James Hayward surveyed a route between Boston and Providence that approximates the path of today's corridor. The line would originate beside a turnpike section of the Old Kings Highway. It wound toward Providence between Dr. Richmond's Church and Boyce's Factory, ducked south of Fowl Meadows, north of Massapoig Pond, then south of Thomas Clark's house. Trains would skirt Purgatory Swamp and the home of Willard Comey before barreling straight through Attleborough's Old Kirk graveyard. Hayward sought the most direct route, though he also reckoned political costs. Joseph Warren Revere sat on the Boston and Providence Railroad's board and wanted trains to serve the Canton cooperage he inherited from his father. The metalworks sat at the bottom of Canton's ravine. Initial plans called for rigging an incline up the Neponset hillside, which would have obliged passengers to transfer to funicular cars. This is a picture of the Belmont Incline in Philadelphia, which was part of Pennsylvania's main line of public works. Canton presented steeper topography, but you get the idea of how such a system might have worked. But instead of an incline, the Boston and Providence resolved to do something more ambitious. They would lay their iron straight through the air. It would take McNeil, Whistler, and Trimble and their workers 2 years to complete the viaduct, which the Providence Journal hailed as an enduring monument to New England resilience. Boston answered New York with a landmark that would outlast the age of canals. The viaduct has carried trains ever since for about 77% of United States history and counting. Today, Acela Expresses, Amtrak Regionals, MBTA commuter trains, CSX freights rumble over Canton's deck like low-flying jets. The B&P is long gone, but thousands of riders rely on its masonry. Thousands retrace the route that James Hayward jotted on parchment the same year the typewriter was invented. Nathan Hale might have boasted that his railroad would save Boston, but he could not have foreseen the line's longevity. The men who scratched their signs in Canton Viaduct never imagined what those stones would carry. In 1832, an article in the new periodical, Railroad Journal, predicted that these tracks would eventually form, quote, a great chain, which is in our day to stretch along the Atlantic coast and bring its chief capitals into rapid, constant, and mutually beneficial relation. Rail segments in New England, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland reached for each other like houseplants towards sunlight. They seemed destined to mesh into something greater than their parts. But 19th century railroaders still thought in more local terms. No one yet knew they were building a corridor. Part 2. South Station. The Boston and Providence became part of the Old Colony Railroad in 1888, and in 1893 was absorbed into the New York, New Haven, and Hartford. Under the corporate leadership of its principal investor, Hartford native John Pierpont Morgan, and his sharp-elbowed executive, Charles Sanger Mellon, the New Haven came to dominate New England passenger rail. At this time, the New Haven was one of several railroads that converged on Boston. The Gilded Age city was laced with tracks, dotted with depots, and packed with yards. In 1899, the newly formed Boston Terminal Corporation unified the city's passenger train operations under one roof. Mayor Josiah Quincy called the structure a wide and spacious gateway of unrestricted freedom. South Station's curving neoclassical facade loomed over Atlantic Avenue, close enough to the harbor that the air carried a salt smell. Wooden masts heaved back and forth on the Fort Point Channel, just footsteps from the East Wing. The terminal provided fitting punctuation for a seaboard main line. By 1913, South Station's 28 tracks handled 38 million passengers, 11 million more than Manhattan's Grand Central Terminal. These passengers included U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who returned from the 1919 Paris Peace Conference at Versailles via an ocean liner that anchored in Boston Harbor. After lunch at the Copley Plaza Hotel and a speech at Mechanics Hall touting his 14-point peace plan for ending the Great War in Europe, Wilson boarded a Washington-bound New Haven train at South Station. Americans lined the route to cheer the president's seeming diplomatic victory. I say seeming because the U.S. never signed the Treaty of Versailles nor joined its League of Nations, so it seemed like they likely would at the time that Wilson was riding along the shoreline of the New Haven. Wilson's victory lap to D.C. may have marked the high point for Northeastern railroading. By mid-century, the region's carriers were hemorrhaging riders to cars, buses, and jets. Interstate 95 reached Massachusetts in 1957. Logan Airport began receiving jet planes 2 years later. In the 1960s, the Boston Terminal Corporation tried to unload its ornate but now overbuilt South Station. Like the Pennsylvania Railroad, which demolished Philadelphia's Broad Street Station in 1952 and Manhattan's Penn Station in 1963, the New Haven saw its future in suburban ridership. A schedule from the period encouraged passengers to drive to its new Route 128 station in Dedham, park free, then take the train. This is one of numerous artifacts in the period that I came across doing research at the Hagley Library in Wilmington, which is an incredible source for Pennsylvania Railroad material, but also through some of its Penn Central archives, the New Haven as well. The Boston Redevelopment Authority eventually bought South Station for $6.9 million plus back taxes. Planners then considered replacing the terminal with a parking garage, a World Trade Center, and even an arena to succeed the unair-conditioned Boston Garden. When gate revenue at Fenway Park plummeted in 1965 to a 20-year low, one study proposed South Station as the site of a new stadium for the ninth-place Red Sox, a relocation that would have raised about 130 years of architectural history at once. In 1972, the Redevelopment Authority settled on the partial conversion of South Station into a postal annex, parking garage, and bus terminal. The structure that Mayor Quincy hailed in 1898 as a wide and spacious gateway lost one of its tan brick wings and almost 2/3 of its tracks. The station's Catholic chapel, Our Lady of the Railways, shuttered, as did its Candlepin bowling alley. Only the original granite head house and smaller, modernized boarding area survived. The entire Northeast corridor from Boston to Washington was deteriorating in the late 20th century, but New England riders arguably suffered the worst. This had much to do with the fact that their main line remained unelectrified east of New Haven. Riders in eastern Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts did not yet benefit from the velocity and acceleration of alternating current transit, a technology that had been enjoyed by riders of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the western section of the New Haven for decades at this point. Their trains remained diesel electric. These limits came into painful focus in 1968 when the federal government sponsored 2 bullet train-inspired high-speed demonstration projects on the corridor. Mid-Atlantic passengers rode the Metroliner, an electric multiple-unit train between New York and Washington. The New York to Boston route, meanwhile, received the United Aircraft Company's turbo train, shown here. The gasoline-powered, turbine-driven machine had hit 170 miles an hour in testing in New Jersey, but averaged just 63 miles per hour on the winding and battered shoreline. New England's corridor could not move forward without serious infrastructural improvements, foremost the installation of catenary. For this, Bay State riders would wait another 30 years. I'm going to jump ahead to the other bookend of the story. Part 3, electrification. By the late 1980s, most of the Northeast Corridor belonged to the National Rail Passenger Corporation, or Amtrak. Recognizing the corridor's importance, Amtrak planned to remedy the line's most glaring drawback, the 157 miles of wireless track between New Haven and Boston. Plans to string catenary to South Station had languished for decades, leaving the line's eastern segment a kind of second-class annex. Boston-bound passengers felt this demotion at New Haven, where they waited for crews to swap out electric engines with diesel locomotives. This schedule indicates that the change took about 9 minutes, but to my memory, it was always seemed like more like 15 or 20. Either way, when the coach lights clicked back on, the now dieselized trains lumbered off toward Massachusetts at an average pace of 56 miles per hour. The ride along New England's southern coast was, as now, incredibly picturesque, but it usually took over 3 hours. Amtrak's David Carroll explained, "They're two different railroads. South of New York, you have the rail lines with homes nearby, but you don't have grade crossings, and you don't have beautiful scenery. And the shorelines that you have here, meaning the line east of New Haven. In southeastern Connecticut, we are literally in people's backyards." Amtrak now sought funding to unite what Carroll called the two different railroads of the Northeast Corridor. Officials saw a chance to sell the project to Ronald Reagan's former vice president and White House successor, George H.W. Bush. 5 days before he lost his re-election bid, the train-loving Connecticut native signed the Amtrak Authorization and Development Act, releasing $1.27 billion to establish, quote, dependable passenger rail between Boston and New York in 3 hours or less. Opposition flared along the shoreline. The electrification project's environmental impact statement received 828 pages of public comments. Trackside residents complained that catenary would spoil coastal vistas. Environmentalists pondered the harm posed to nesting osprey and short-nosed sturgeon. A tennis club in Connecticut worried that increased train traffic would force members to, quote, stop play more frequently. Some claimed the new trains would be too loud. Others feared that the silence of electric engines posed the real threat. A few alleged that high-voltage wires emitted cancer-causing electromagnetic fields. One group, calling itself Citizens Against the Amtrak Electrification Project, argued that the venture doesn't help southeastern Connecticut. New Yorkers and Bostonians will benefit, the group claimed, not people along the southeastern coast. When Amtrak announced that it would add 33 trains a day to the electrified line, the fight re-centered around the line's movable bridges. Upstream marinas needed these spans open so that sailboats and fishing charters could enter Long Island Sound. More trains presumably meant fewer openings. One boatyard owner urged the Department of Transportation that, quote, our coastline is the most valuable asset Connecticut has. Please do not destroy this asset by eliminating access to the Long Island Sound and some of the best recreational and fishing waters in the world, exclamation point. Amtrak, Connecticut, and the Coast Guard finally hammered out an agreement. By installing more sensitive signals, Amtrak could scale up train frequency while keeping inlets open to boats 40 minutes per hour between 5 a.m. and midnight. Amtrak received its environmental permit and construction began. Under this initial agreement, the continent's busiest railroad would contain saltwater gaps much of the waking day. The electrification project broke ground in 1996. Crews planted 15,000 catenary poles in New England's ancient volcanic coast. In some places, the granite subsurface required jackhammers. Elsewhere, vacuums sucked up marsh muck before concrete foundations could be poured. In Boston, workers, and I apologize for the poor quality of some of these old images. In Boston, workers wove wire through the rebar chaos of another mega project, the Big Dig. Construction of the new I-93 tunnel made the corridor tracks sink at one point. Nothing came easy. But when the new millennium dawned over Massachusetts, the corridor's freshest catenary buzzed with current. On January 28, 2000, an Amtrak mail train pulled into Boston South Station behind an AEM 7. Passenger service began 3 days later with an electrification celebration special, which departed South Station, then abruptly tripped a breaker. The train slowed and the carriage lights dimmed. After a long moment, the lights blinked on and the train regained speed to the immense relief of Amtrak officials and riding dignitaries. I take this anecdote from the New York Times article I'm showing here, but I also take it with a grain of salt because its reporter was Jason Blair, who later resigned from the paper after he was caught fabricating stories. Fortunately, I received a letter this fall from Walter H. Peters, a former Penn Central employee who was aboard the celebration special, and he confirms most of the details from firsthand experience. So the celebration special swept south across Massachusetts and slipped through the tunnels under Providence. It banked through Stonington, Mystic, Groton, Old Saybrook, and several seaside towns that had fought electrification, all on its way to Penn Station. The corridor was now what Amtrak President George Warrington called a powerhouse of an engine that will help power the economy of a region. Amtrak's largest investment and its greatest asset had drawn Boston back into the main line of Northeastern passenger railroading. Electrification also laid the groundwork for the corridor's third century, which opened with the age of Acela. Part 4, Acela. Today, the first generation Acela Express is on its last legs, waiting for Alstom's Avelia to send it into retirement, hopefully sometime this year or by next year's early winter. After 2 decades, the original train has proven a mixed bag, extremely popular with riders, but plagued by design flaws and mechanical faults. It can therefore be hard to remember the excitement that greeted Acela's arrival back at the turn of the millennium in the early 2000s. To recall this cultural moment, I'm going to open Acela's story in what might seem like an unlikely place. This is the Oak Room, an upscale bar tucked into Back Bay's Copley Plaza Hotel, the same hotel where Woodrow Wilson dined before catching his train from South Station. Picture this bar on a cold night in late 2000. A wood fire crackles, crystal chandeliers blaze over copper counters, piano chords patter through the din of laughter. A bartender rattles ice, vodka, and curacao to a sapphire froth, plunks in 3 blue olives, and pours it into a martini glass. This concoction was called a Celatini. This was an actual drink that was served at the Copley Plaza Hotel. It cost $15 back in 2000, and as journalist Betsy Wade relays, it turned lips blue. 1 block from Copley Plaza, under Dartmouth Street, in a trench beside I-90, is an actual Acela. The gray train with blue accents has two motors, one leading, one trailing, to form a reversible set. Its aerodynamic noses tapered into canonical nubs. Its motors whirred through exhaust gills. The engines mesh with their power cars and carriages in a seamless cannular streak. Acela looked like a stylized torpedo, in the words of one journalist. It looked sort of French. When the train hit 165 miles per hour on a test track in Pueblo, Colorado in 1999, the achievement seemed to justify the shoreline electrification, billions of dollars in corridor improvements, maybe even Amtrak itself. Acela vindicated everyone who fought for the future of American passenger trains. It was the stuff drinks get named for. The first Acela to carry passengers left Washington on November 16, 1999. Press gathered in Union Station for the 10 a.m. departure from Track 20. National Public Radio's Jack Speer likened the christening to the launch of an ocean liner. Amtrak President George Warrington compared Acela's inaugural voyage to, quote, the introduction of the jet engine and the building of the interstate highway system. The launch of Acela Express is one of those truly defining moments, Amtrak chairman and Wisconsin Governor Tommy Thompson said before cracking open a bottle of champagne across the train's nose, drenching former Massachusetts governor and train advocate Michael Dukakis. Acela entered regular service in the pre-dawn murk of December 16. It ratcheted up to 135 miles an hour. After leaving Washington, it ratcheted up to 135 miles an hour on New Jersey straightaway, where the turbo train once tested. After New York, Acela bobbed along Connecticut's shoreline before opening up on the flats above Block Island Sound. Near Kingston, Rhode Island, Acela touched and for a few hushed seconds held 150 miles an hour. An hour later, Acela eased through Back Bay and entered South Station beneath a burst of fireworks. Boston was now about 3.5 hours from Manhattan. Acela made the city on a hill a true corridor terminus. If for one night Acela was the toast of New England, the next morning brought hangover. The dazzling first run turned out to have damaged the lead engine's pantograph. A backup Acela lacked hot water and a working freezer, so an AEM 7 and Amfleet consist substituted on the Morning Express, which then, of course, stalled out in Bridgeport. In its first few months, Acela would delight and dishearten riders. The sleek train impressed journalists and business travelers, but its pantograph tangled with catenary, its undercarriage yaw dampeners cracked, brush fires, landslides, and lightning strikes disrupted service. By late summer, the corridor's bright future began to resemble its fraught past. Acela was, in the words of Amtrak critic Joseph Vranich, both the Northeast Corridor's crown jewel and a remarkable fiasco. America's latest attempt at a bullet train, the Acela, began in 1992, when Amtrak secured money to electrify the shoreline. After its success with the Swedish import, the AEM 7, Amtrak decided to test drive a pair of European trains, the Swedish-Swiss X2000 and the German Intercity Express. I thought I'd stepped onto a cloud, mused one Amtrak rider stepping off the X2000, which banked into curves, reducing the G-forces felt aboard ordinary coaches. The tilting X2000 turned out to be too wispy for the corridor. Scarred by the fatal 1987 collision of Amtrak's Colonial with a Conrail freight engine driven by Ricky Gates, the Federal Railroad Administration required passenger trains to have enough mass to sustain an impact generating 800,000 pounds of horizontal force. The Swedes and Germans refused to bulk up their designs and withdrew. Lacking an off-the-shelf option, Amtrak asked a consortium led by Canada's Bombardier Corporation and the French firm Alstom to develop a compliant solution. The resulting machine combined the TGV's propulsion system with the tilting mechanism that helped the X2000 navigate the twisting track between Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Oslo, a right-of-way that resembled the winding New Haven shoreline. Alstom-Bombardier's train offered speed and versatility on the corridor's rugged terrain. The consortium clinched the deal by financing Amtrak's purchase. The cash-strapped railroad essentially paid no money down. Alstom-Bombardier even agreed to assemble the trains in two economically depressed American cities, the former granite hub of Barre, Vermont, and Plattsburgh, New York, which had been devastated by the closure of a local Air Force base. Problems began soon, and they started with the train's regulatory heft. Acela looked like a TGV from the outside, but weighed almost twice as much as one. French engineers called the train cochon, meaning pig. Former Amtrak president Tom Downs preferred high-velocity bank vault. The coaches somehow wound up 4 inches wider than intended, which meant that Acela could not fully tilt or bank into turns without the risk of sideswiping other trains. Acela languished in testing. Its launch drifted from early 1999 to late 2000. Amtrak leased billboards along I-95 to showcase its new service to haggard motorists, but the signs, which featured this woman with blunt bangs, one eye shut, and a train popping out of her ear, mostly came down before Acela actually hit the rails. Relations between Amtrak and Alstom-Bombardier chilled in a flurry of fines, suits, countersuits, and bickering over interior decor. Curtain design apparently became an intractable sticking point. The new train was initially in design called American Flyer, after a model railroad kit sold by a Rector set inventor and New Haven railfan Alfred Carlton Gilbert. In 1999, marketers debuted a new name that mushed together the words acceleration and excellence. No one knew at first how to say Acela. The sibilant puree bedeviled newscasters who mispronounced it every which way. If you go back to YouTube clips from the era, you will find people saying Acela, 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 and all these other mispronunciations. In the early days, the New York Times and Wall Street Journal snuck phonetic assistance, Acela, into their articles so people would know how to say the word. Were the word not baffling enough, Amtrak applied it to all kinds of corridor trains, including its new premium service, the Express. Conventional intercity runs became Acela Regional, and for a brief moment, the clockers that lumbered between New York and Philadelphia were to be called Acela Commuter. Acela's postmodern marketing campaign invited riders to depart from your inhibitions and return your mind to its upright position. Posters stamped with the tagline, Life on Acela, appeared to sell something more conceptual than trains, like life insurance or antidepressants, one journalist suggested. Amtrak accessorized the Acela lifestyle through a catalog of merchandise that included mouse pads, CD cases, a plush bear named Ace, and gourmet chocolates confected by chef George Perrier. Yeah, the early 2000s feel like ancient history to me when I came across this catalog at the Hagley. Acela is more than just a name, George Warrington told his employees. Acela is a brand representing a whole new way of doing business. Acela Express carried over 1 million riders in its first year. Amtrak's split of the air-rail travel market between New York and Boston jumped from 18% to 40%. Acela skeptics noted that the new train reached its vaunted top speed on less than 24 miles of track, and that it saved more time skipping stops than it did from dynamic tilting. Acela, critics claimed, was a timetable mirage that lagged far behind global benchmarks for high-speed rail. A French TGV had, after all, topped 320 miles per hour in 1990. Passengers did not seem to care. 9 months into service, Acela ridership spiked when the September 11th terrorist attacks sent traumatized flyers crowding onto trains. The corridor provided a logistical backstop during the two-day closure of American civilian airspace. Amtrak's the Northeast Corridor's passenger swell abated as airports reopened and the federal government orchestrated a $5 billion airline bailout. But many Northeasterners stuck with trains, thanks partly to the Department of Homeland Security's new laborious screening procedures, which made shuttle flights much less efficient because you would spend such a longer percentage of your time on the ground in airports going through security, et cetera. In 2009, an Acela advertisement enticed customers with the option of, quote, taking off your shoes only if you feel like it. Between 2000 and 2021, Amtrak's portion of the air rail market from New York to Boston grew from 20% to 75%, which is around where it is right now. For all its flaws, Acela has permanently changed how Northeasterners move about the region. Conclusion from here. Southwest of Massachusetts, the corridor is now receiving some of America's most ambitious and expensive infrastructural upgrades. The new Frederick Douglass Tunnel that will carry trains beneath the streets of Baltimore, a new Susquehanna River Bridge in Maryland, and a new Gateway Bridge over the Hackensack River in New Jersey. New tunnels under the Hudson River, and perhaps a reimagined Penn Station that might build upon the momentum of Moynihan Train Hall. Development is also visible in Massachusetts. South Station is again a construction site, as builders realize plans to raise an office tower behind the 125-year-old granite facade and to finish a concourse that should make it easier for passengers to transfer between trains and buses. More ambitiously, a proposed north-south rail link would connect Boston's north and south stations via tunnels. This project, if ever undertaken, would allow MBTA to run trains through downtown Boston and Amtrak to connect its popular Downeastern service with corridor trains. It's not hard to imagine that if electrified, this connection could extend what we think of as the corridor into New Hampshire and Maine. It's impossible to know at the moment. But as my book wagers, one of the best ways to understand this process is to pay attention to what's already happened. After 200 years, the corridor is still making the Northeast what it is. The train line is still arriving. Thank you. Thank you for everybody who's correcting my pronunciation. That has definitely been something I've learned in saying some of these things out loud. I seek out phonetic assistance, and when you work in archives, you don't say it out loud. So Copley and Barry. I took a guess. I should have looked that one up too. Very much appreciated. Thank you so much. I'll make sure to note it in the future.
And you may not be familiar with the geography of Barry, Vermont, but the factory was located at the top of a bluff near a granite quarry, which is still in operation. And the railroad to get there is 3 switchbacks, I believe 3, to get up to the top of it. We're friendly with the Vermont rail system, and we have told it that if you fix it, we will come. So anyway, we have a question here from Lucius, looking a bit further south on the corridor. When did Metro North redo its electrification from 25 hertz to 60 hertz?
I'd have to look that up right now. I mean, I know I was in Danbury recently, and what I noticed about the catenary is most of the catenary is new, but it seems like every other catenary pole is from the original New Haven. So it's a kind of fascinating mixture of old and new infrastructure working together at the current moment. And yeah, I mean, right now, the upper end of the New England's corridor has the best wire on the system. And it's now some of the old stretches of the Pennsylvania Railroad that need to be upgraded.
Okay, well, if there's no other questions.
I see one in the comments. What do you think will happen in the future? The Acela is an oxymoron in the definition of high-speed rail. Will there need to be a new right of way? So one of the things that I really hope to do with this book is to stir conversations between a large number of people who are really excited about the possibilities of what passenger rail can do in the United States and can do for cities and communities they're very excited about the policy and potential of passenger rail, but they know nothing about or very little about the operations. And so what I'm hoping is to try to create some conversations between members, professionals, people who've worked on railroads, people who know how railroads are run, the enormous body of knowledge in the railroad enthusiast community, and to kind of connect those. Because I think right now, if I, talk to friends or go someplace like Twitter, everybody says, why can't we have a TGV? Why can't we have something like China's high-speed rail? And they'll often put up, you've probably seen these maps of train lines where one could go from Boston to New York in 45 minutes or whatnot. And I think that the best way forward with the corridor are incremental improvements. I think we can make the line faster, but I think the idea of building the line from scratch would require such enormous use of eminent domain, would probably require the displacement of people, of businesses, of communities. So, I mean, I think that this is incremental. It's not exactly as stirring as some of the kind of images one will see online, but I think that's the best way to go about the line. And I mean, one of the big things that I would like to see in terms of the corridor's future is for trains to become more affordable. It's such an efficient way to travel. It shouldn't necessarily have to cost the end consumer, so much more than, say, Chinatown buses do, or driving on one's own. Now, those are policy questions, but I'd like to see the line become more available to wider sets of riders, because I think it is the best, most efficient, environmentally conscious way to travel between big cities in the Northeast.
So again, thank you very much, David, for a very interesting and informative program.